She walked into the dealership, jeans and a simple white t-shirt, seeking a luxury car. The salesman scrutinized her, a sneer twisting his lips. "I'm sorry, but I think you're in the wrong place," he hissed, gesturing toward the exit. Other staff members chuckled, customers stared. Humiliation flushed her face. She left without a word. The next morning, a gleaming Rolls-Royce Phantom pulled up. The salesman's jaw dropped. He'd never seen it coming. Maggie, simple white t-shirt and well-worn jeans, stepped inside. Her quiet confidence radiated, a knowing strength beneath the modest exterior. She was the founder of the Collins Foundation, transforming thousands of lives. She sought a midnight blue coupe, a gift for her sister. Blake, the sales manager, smirked. This would be amusing. "Good morning, Maggie," a young salesman, Daniel, greeted. "Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors. Is there something specific you're interested in today?" Blake smoothly intercepted. "I'll handle this, Daniel." He turned to Maggie, a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Looking for directions, ma'am?" Maggie politely pointed to the Azure. "I'd really like to learn more about this one." Blake's smile tightened. "Limited edition Azure, only 15 made this year. Perhaps our used car division?" His eyes lingered on her scuffed sneakers. Maggie persisted. "Is it possible to see the interior?" Blake's expression soured. "By appointment only." He lied smoothly. A couple in designer clothes entered. Blake's demeanor transformed instantly. "Excuse me, Maggie." He gestured to Daniel. "A brochure, perhaps?" Maggie stood quietly. "I'm specifically interested in this car for my sister's birthday next month." Blake's veneer cracked. "This isn't a yard sale. We're talking about $250,000. He gestured dismissively at her clothes. "People who can afford these cars don't dress like." Maggie's anger ignited. "I believe my money is as good as anyone else's." Blake's disdain was palpable. "Leave the premises." Silence. Richard Mason, the owner, intervened. "Miss Collins, perhaps a misunderstanding?" Maggie's voice steady. "Your sales manager has made your policies quite clear." Blake stepped forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "Appointment, proof of funds, the right attire." Maggie simply turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, Blake's voice echoed. "Some people just don't know their place." Outside, she called Alexander, her husband. The humiliation stung, but a resolve sparked. "This isn't about me," she told him, recounting the incident. "It's about others." Alexander nodded. A plan formed. The following morning, a Rolls-Royce Phantom arrived. Alexander Collins, impeccably dressed, sought the Azure. Blake's smile vanished. "Mr. Collins, I don't recall." Alexander's expression cooled. "My wife was here yesterday. She was treated poorly, based solely on her attire." Mason paled. "Mr. Collins, I assure you, this does not reflect our values." Alexander, calmly, "My wife runs the Collins Foundation, raising millions for children with disabilities. She values modesty despite immense wealth. She finds it keeps her connected." "Perhaps a training program on unconscious bias," Alexander suggested. Blake's world shattered. He was humbled. A month later, the Collins Foundation Gala. Blake, in the staff uniform, helped children. Maggie and Alexander genuinely connecting with everyone. Blake's perspective had shifted profoundly. The late afternoon sun slanted through the dealership windows, catching the dust motes dancing in the air. Maggie stood there, a simple woman in worn jeans and a plain white t-shirt, a stark contrast to the gleaming chrome and polished leather surrounding her. She'd come seeking a car, a midnight blue coupe, a gift for her sister Caroline, a sister who'd faced a battle and emerged victorious. A victory that deserved more than words. It deserved a sleek, powerful machine that sang of freedom and new beginnings. The salesman, his eyes narrowed, took her in. A quick appraisal, a dismissive glance. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his tone sharp, "but I think you're in the wrong place." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken assumptions, a judgment delivered not just to Maggie, but to anyone who dared to dream beyond their perceived limitations. The air thickened with the subtle snickers of his colleagues, the curious stares of other customers. Shame, a familiar sting, warmed Maggie's cheeks. She turned, a silent retreat from the unspoken accusations. It wasn't the rejection that stung. It was the presumption, the casual cruelty of judging a book by its cover before even turning a page. The next morning, the silence outside the dealership was shattered by a different kind of arrival. The deep hum of a Rolls-Royce Phantom, a midnight blue behemoth, filled the space, a powerful statement parked directly across from the entrance. The salesman, the one who dismissed her, watched, his jaw slack with disbelief. He didn't recognize her initially, of course. How could he? This wasn't the simple woman who'd walked in yesterday. This was a reflection of everything he'd failed to see. This was power, quiet and formidable, a different face on the same woman, a face that now held all the quiet strength she'd cultivated from years of adversity. Back at her home, nestled on 5 quiet acres outside Boston, Maggie sat across from her husband, Alexander. The quiet elegance of their home belied the billions amassed by Alexander's innovative work in renewable energy. He'd built his fortune quietly, deliberately avoiding the spotlight, a man who valued substance over show. 15 years of marriage had honed Alexander's ability to read Maggie's emotions, to see past the surface. He saw the hurt simmering beneath her quiet demeanor. "What happened?" he asked, his voice soft, a gentle hand reaching across the desk. Maggie took a deep breath, the weight of the afternoon settling on her shoulders. "It was educational," she began, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. She described the dealership, the condescending salesman, the humiliation of being judged solely on her appearance. She recounted the sting of the snickers, the pointed stares, the feeling of being invisible, of her worth being dismissed. Alexander listened, his expression hardening with each word. He'd seen the world's harshness, but this was a wound inflicted not by indifference, but by deliberate malice. He'd known Maggie for years. He'd watched her build the Collins Foundation for Children with Disabilities from the ground up. He'd seen her pour her heart and soul and her considerable intellect into creating tangible, life-altering change for thousands of children. He knew the depth of her compassion, the quiet power she held. Yet here she was, diminished, belittled by someone who hadn't taken the time to see. "It's not about me," Maggie said, her voice barely a whisper. "I can afford to walk away, knowing the truth. But how many others face that kind of judgment every single day without the means to prove them wrong?" Her voice trembled slightly, the unspoken pain resonating deeply. Alexander nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. It wasn't just the personal slight. It was the injustice, the casual cruelty, the systemic bias that had made Maggie's experience so profoundly painful. He saw it not as an isolated incident, but as a reflection of a broader issue, a reminder of the prejudices that remain hidden beneath a polished exterior. "So, what do you want to do?" he asked finally, his voice quiet but determined. He knew that the answer would not be simple revenge. Maggie was far more profound than that. A long silence hung between them, the weight of the unspoken words heavy in the air. Maggie considered her options. A quiet strength settled over her face. This wasn't simply about getting a car for her sister. It had become something so much bigger. It was about educating those who couldn't see beyond superficial appearances. It was about helping others who, unlike her, might not have the resources to counter prejudice. It was about creating genuine change. She wouldn't seek vengeance, no. But awareness was a different story entirely, and Alexander, sensing her quiet resolve, knew precisely what to do. Across the showroom, Blake Thompson, the sales manager, adjusted his tie, a practiced movement that spoke volumes about his carefully constructed persona. He watched Maggie, his eyes assessing, calculating. He prided himself on his ability to spot a serious buyer instantly, and Maggie, in her simple clothes, was clearly not fitting the mold. A smirk touched his lips as he exchanged a knowing glance with his colleagues. This was going to be amusing. A young salesman, Daniel, approached Maggie with a polite smile. "Good morning. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors. I'm Daniel. Is there something specific you're interested in today?" Before Maggie could answer, Blake smoothly intervened. His voice, though pleasant, held an undercurrent of authority. "I'll handle this, Daniel," he said, his eyes never leaving Maggie. The practiced smile he offered her didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a mask, carefully crafted to conceal the disdain simmering beneath the surface. "Looking for directions, ma'am?" The question hung in the air, heavy with condescension. Maggie, unfazed, responded with a quiet confidence that belied the subtle slight. "Actually," she said, her voice even and pleasant, "I'm interested in that midnight blue coupe." She gestured towards the Azure, its sleek lines gleaming under the showroom lights. Blake's smile tightened. He'd seen this before. people who wandered in, lost in daydreams of unattainable luxury. With end-of-month quotas looming and 3 serious buyers already scheduled, he had no patience for fantasies. "That's the limited edition Azure," he said, each word clipped, sharp. "Only 15 were made this year." His tone was dismissive, patronizing, as if speaking to a child who didn't understand the realities of the world. "Perhaps I could direct you to our used car division. It's just a few blocks away." Maggie's gaze fell on his polished shoes, then subtly shifted back up to his face. She noticed the way his eyes lingered on her scuffed sneakers, a micro-judgment. She held her ground. "I'd really like to learn more about this one," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Is it possible to see the interior?" The request was simple, polite, but laced with a quiet strength, a subtle challenge to his assumptions. He could see it if he'd only chosen to look past her clothes. Blake's expression soured. He glanced behind him. 2 of his colleagues exchanged knowing glances. "The Azure is by appointment only," he lied smoothly, his practiced charm faltering slightly. "Our serious clients typically schedule private viewings." His words hung heavy with implications of exclusivity, a deliberate wall erected to keep those who weren't supposed to be there on the other side. Just then, a couple, impeccably dressed in designer clothing, entered the showroom. Blake's demeanor changed instantly. The practiced smile returned, full and bright this time. The world had instantly shifted for him, and as he completely ignored Maggie, he knew his behavior had cemented its place. The quiet respect Maggie held was replaced with cold indifference. The stage was set, a clear demonstration that for Blake, appearances meant everything. Daniel, his youthful face etched with an apologetic smile, began to explain the Azure's features, his words tumbling over each other in his eagerness to be helpful. He spoke of the engine's purr, the supple leather, the handcrafted details. He spoke with a genuine enthusiasm that contrasted sharply with Blake's practiced indifference. Maggie listened, appreciating his kindness, his willingness to connect despite the clear discomfort radiating from the situation. Across the showroom, Maggie watched Blake expertly navigate his sales pitch with the Harringtons. He opened the driver's side door of the Azure with a flourish, inviting Mrs. Harrington to luxuriate in the plush leather interior. The very same car that he had just moments before declared to be by appointment only. The blatant hypocrisy was almost too much. The casual cruelty felt heavy in the air, and while Maggie was used to such treatment, she could feel the silent discomfort from Daniel and felt its impact. She continued to listen, nodding occasionally, but her gaze frequently drifted towards Blake, observing his practiced charm, his practiced manipulation. She was acutely aware of how his demeanor changed around those he perceived to be worthy of his attention. It was a masterclass in performative empathy. The dismissive way he'd glanced at her moments before, a fleeting glance filled with casual disregard, was still fresh in her memory. The contrast was stark. The cruelty in his treatment of her felt so unnecessary. She felt a slow burn of anger, not for herself. She'd weathered such treatment before, but for the countless others who would be subjected to the same prejudices and would not have the strength to simply walk away. Maggie allowed Daniel to finish his description of the vehicle, thanking him politely. Then, quietly, almost as an afterthought, she approached the Harringtons and Blake. The quiet strength of her advance seemed to halt the conversation, just a slight pause, but long enough for everyone present to acknowledge her presence. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm and measured, breaking through Blake's carefully constructed performance. "I was hoping to inquire about purchasing this model." Blake's carefully crafted smile faltered. The practiced ease of his manner vanished, replaced by a barely concealed irritation. "As I mentioned earlier," he said, his voice tight, "this vehicle is being shown to these customers. Perhaps you could come back another time, or, as I suggested, check our used car options." The words hung in the air, heavy with an implied dismissal of her ability and worth. The Harringtons, uncomfortable witnesses to this awkward exchange, shifted uneasily. Maggie, her eyes unwavering, met his gaze. "I'm specifically interested in this car," she repeated, her voice soft but firm. "For my sister's birthday next month." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of her quiet determination. It was time for the scales of justice to be balanced. The quiet power of her determination was ready to be unleashed. "I'm prepared to make a cash purchase today," Maggie said, her voice quiet but firm. The words hung in the air, a stark contrast to the hushed expectancy that had fallen over the showroom. Several nearby customers had stopped their conversations, drawn in by the simmering tension. Daniel watched anxiously from the periphery, his youthful face reflecting the discomfort of the situation. Blake's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. A harsh, short laugh escaped his lips, echoing across the polished floor. Heads turned. The sound was sharp, cruel, designed to cut Maggie down. "A cash purchase, really?" he sneered, his voice deliberately loud, designed to humiliate. "This isn't a yard sale. We're talking about $250,000. People who can afford these cars don't dress like." He gestured dismissively at her clothes, his contempt barely concealed. A flush crept across Maggie's cheeks, but it wasn't the flush of embarrassment. It was the slow burn of anger, a righteous fire ignited not by the insult itself, but by the blatant injustice of it all. She'd faced this before, this casual dismissal based on appearance. But it wasn't just about her. It was about all the others who had been judged, dismissed, their potential overlooked because of how they looked. "I believe my money is as good as anyone else's," she said, her voice quiet but steady, a quiet strength resonating in her tone. Blake stepped closer, looming over her, his disdain no longer hidden. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are wasting my time and embarrassing yourself. Either make an appointment for a serious discussion, dressed appropriately, or please leave the premises." The showroom fell silent. The Harringtons, visibly uncomfortable, shifted away from the azure. The weight of Blake's words pressed down on everyone present, a heavy blanket of awkwardness and shame. Even the other salesmen stood frozen, their eyes darting between Maggie and Blake. The silence stretched, taut and uncomfortable. Then, a new voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Richard Mason, the dealership owner, had arrived, drawn by the sudden hush. He surveyed the scene, his gaze lingering on Maggie, on the silent onlookers, and then finally on Blake. The unspoken judgment in his eyes was a betrayal of a silent complicity that had allowed Blake's actions to unfold. It was clear, even to the silent crowd, where his sympathies lay. Maggie, her dignity intact despite the sting of humiliation, turned and walked towards the exit. Behind her, she heard Blake's voice, his words carrying a callous disregard. "Some people just don't know their place." Outside, bathed in the morning sunlight, the sting of humiliation was still raw. But as Maggie reached for her phone, a small, resolute smile formed on her lips. It was a smile of quiet power, of unwavering determination. The call she was about to make would change everything. The Collins estate was a quiet sanctuary, its understated elegance a reflection of Alexander's own personality. He preferred it that way, a man who valued substance over ostentation. When Maggie entered his home office, the events of the day still etched on her face, Alexander immediately set aside his work. 15 years of marriage had taught him to read her unspoken emotions with a precision that bordered on intuition. "What happened?" he asked, his voice a low rumble, concern etched on his features. He rose from his desk, circling around to meet her. Maggie sank into a leather chair, the weight of the afternoon heavy upon her. The hurt was palpable, but the anger simmered just beneath the surface. "It was educational," she said, a weary smile twisting her lips. It was a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a smile that spoke volumes of unspoken frustrations. She recounted her visit to Boston Luxury Motors, the condescending salesman, the humiliation of being judged, the casual cruelty of being dismissed. Her voice remained steady, yet a tremor ran beneath the surface, betraying the depth of her feelings. She described the sting of the dismissive glances, the snickers, the feeling of being invisible, of her worth being disregarded purely because of how she was dressed. Alexander listened, his expression growing increasingly grim, his quiet demeanor mirroring the depth of his simmering outrage. When she finished, a long silence hung in the air, broken only by the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. It wasn't just the personal indignity that weighed on her. It was the injustice of it all, the reminder that such treatment was commonplace, a systemic failure of empathy. "It's not about me," Maggie said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I have the privilege of walking away, knowing the truth. But how many people face that same judgment every day without the comfort of knowing they could actually afford what they're being denied? Alexander nodded, understanding the depth of her concern. He'd seen firsthand Maggie's unwavering dedication to the Collins Foundation, her relentless pursuit of improving the lives of children with disabilities. In their years together, it was her compassion, her consistent concern for others, that had always moved him most deeply. "So, what would you like to do about it?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady, a strength underlying his calm demeanor. He knew that simple retribution wouldn't be enough for her. Maggie's spirit was too profound for such a superficial response. "Part of me wants to do nothing," Maggie admitted, her voice low. "Just buy Caroline her gift elsewhere. But then I think about that young salesman, Daniel, the one who treated me with respect, regardless of how I was dressed. And I think about all the others who face that kind of judgment without having any recourse." Her gaze locked with Alexander's, a silent plea resonating in her eyes. "These people need to understand that worth isn't determined by appearance. But I don't want vengeance. I want awareness." Alexander nodded slowly, a plan beginning to form in his mind. "I think I might have an idea that accomplishes both," he said softly. "Nothing too dramatic," Maggie warned, knowing her husband's protective instincts. "No buying the dealership and firing everyone." Alexander chuckled. "Nothing so cliché, but maybe a little education is in order." A subtle gleam appeared in his eyes, a quiet determination setting his features. Their plan wouldn't be about revenge. It would be about profound and lasting change. It would be about justice, but also about building empathy. And it would begin tomorrow. The following morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the shadows Maggie had carried from the previous day. At precisely 10:17 a.m., a distinctive purr, low and resonant, cut through the usual city sounds. It was a sound that commanded attention, a sound that spoke of power and understated elegance. Outside Boston Luxury Motors, a vehicle unlike any other glided to a stop, its midnight blue paint shimmering in the sunlight. It was a Rolls-Royce Phantom, extended wheelbase, a bespoke model, its value conservatively estimated to be well over $1 million. Blake Thompson, straightening his signature blue tie, watched from inside the dealership. Even he, accustomed to the daily spectacle of luxury cars, felt his pulse quicken. This was beyond a good prospect. This was the kind of client dealerships dreamed of, the kind whose purchases could launch 1,000 sales. This was different. This felt like retribution. The chauffeur, impeccably uniformed, exited the Rolls-Royce, moving with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to handling such vehicles. He opened the rear passenger door with white-gloved precision. From the car emerged a man of commanding presence, tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that spoke of quiet wealth, not flashy extravagance. His salt and pepper hair was perfectly groomed, his posture effortlessly authoritative. His very presence radiated quiet power. Blake's salesman instincts kicked into overdrive. This was more than just a sale. This was a potential gold mine. He moved quickly, intercepting the man before any other salesperson could approach. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors. Blake Thompson, sales manager. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today." Blake's voice was smooth, practiced, his smile carefully calibrated to convey genuine warmth and deference. The words were the tools of his trade, but they held an undercurrent of something else. There was a self-assured confidence, born of an arrogant belief in his invincibility. He didn't know he was about to meet his match. The man regarded Blake with an expression that was impossible to read. Then, a polite smile touched his lips, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, betraying an underlying tension. "Alexander Collins," he said, extending a hand in a firm handshake. The name registered vaguely in Blake's mind, but it held no immediate significance. The Rolls-Royce, however, spoke volumes about the man's financial capacity. "Mr. Collins, it's truly an honor. What brings you to our humble establishment today? Perhaps I could show you our newest arrivals? We just received a limited edition." Alexander raised a hand, halting Blake's practiced pitch. "Actually," he said, his voice calm, measured, "I'm here about a specific vehicle, the Azure Coupe, midnight blue." Blake's smile widened. "Excellent choice, sir. One of only 15 produced this year. I'd be delighted to show you." Alexander interrupted smoothly, a subtle shift in his demeanor, signaling a change in the dynamics of the conversation. "I know where it is," he said, his eyes holding a steady gaze. "My wife was here yesterday, expressing interest in it." A flicker of confusion crossed Blake's face, a crack in his carefully constructed mask of professional courtesy. "Your wife? I don't recall. Perhaps one of my colleagues assisted her." Alexander's expression hardened, the polite veneer beginning to melt away, replaced by a cold certainty. "No, Mr. Thompson. You assisted her, or rather, you refused to assist her. Margaret Collins. She was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. You suggested she might be more comfortable looking at used cars." The blood drained from Blake's face. He was unprepared for this turn of events. The air crackled with anticipation. The moment of reckoning was finally here. The quiet strength of Alexander's presence was about to be fully revealed. The game had begun, but in a way, Blake had lost it long ago. The color drained from Blake's face. The practiced ease of his demeanor shattered, replaced by a stark, unsettling silence. He stammered. His usual smooth delivery abandoned him. "Mr. Collins, there must be some misunderstanding. We welcome all customers here." His words were weak, unconvincing, a pathetic attempt to salvage a situation he'd irrevocably damaged. By now, Richard Mason, the dealership owner, had approached, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. His expression was one of cautious concern, a mixture of apprehension and dawning realization. "Is everything all right, Blake?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, yet betraying a hint of unease. Alexander turned his attention to Mason, his gaze unwavering. "Mr. Mason, I presume?" "Yes, indeed. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors," Mason replied, extending a hand. His smile was strained, a thin veil barely concealing his rising apprehension. "Thank you," Alexander said, accepting the handshake, his grip firm. "I was just explaining to Mr. Thompson that my wife visited yesterday, interested in purchasing the Azure Coupe as a gift for her sister. She was, however, treated in a manner that I find troubling." His voice was measured, each word carrying the weight of quiet indignation. Richard's carefully constructed composure began to crumble. I'm sorry to hear that," he stammered, his eyes darting between Alexander and Blake. "I believe I was briefly involved in a conversation, but I wasn't aware of all the details." Alexander nodded slowly, his gaze unwavering. "The details include your sales manager here, suggesting that people like her, people who dress simply, perhaps, don't belong in an establishment like this, based solely on her casual attire." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. A small crowd had begun to gather, other salespeople, support staff, and even a few early customers drawn in by the palpable tension. The showroom had fallen utterly silent. The weight of Alexander's words seemed to fill the space, suffocating the usual confident atmosphere. Blake opened his mouth to speak, desperation creeping into his voice. But before he could utter a word, Daniel, the young salesman, spoke up. All eyes turned to him. Even he looked surprised by his own courage. "Miss Collins was treated poorly," Daniel said, his voice clear and strong. "She was polite, specific about her interest in the Azure, and she was dismissed repeatedly, based on her appearance." A withering look from Blake was lost in the sudden shift in the dynamics of the room. The damage was done. The quiet power of a simple act of truth and courage had irrevocably shifted the tide. The silent judgment of the onlookers now felt far more heavy and pointed towards Blake. The silent strength of the situation settled over the entire room. Alexander turned his attention back to Richard Mason. "You know, it's interesting," he began, his voice calm, but the underlying strength undeniable. "My wife not only found the dealership lacking, but also runs the Collins Foundation for Children with Disabilities. It's been her life's work since before I met her. She's raised over $50 million for specialized medical equipment and educational programs." He paused, letting the weight of those words sink in, letting the stark contrast between Maggie's appearance and her accomplishments settle upon Mason and Blake. "She chooses to dress simply because she believes in living modestly despite our means. It's one of the countless reasons I love her." The unspoken message hung heavy in the air, that true worth is measured not in designer labels, but in the impact a person has on the world. The silent onlookers shifted. Their earlier judgment now felt painfully misplaced. Richard Mason, his face pale, could only manage a weak, Mr. Collins, I assure you, this does not reflect the values of our dealership. We pride ourselves on. Alexander interrupted firmly, his voice steady but laced with a quiet steel. Actions speak louder than mission statements, Mr. Mason. The quiet power of his words hung in the air, a challenge, a promise. The confrontation was far from over, but Alexander held the undeniable high ground. The silence in the showroom was thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Then Daniel, the young salesman, spoke. His voice was quiet at first, almost hesitant, but it grew stronger with each word, fueled by a quiet courage that surprised even himself. Miss Collins was treated poorly, he said, his gaze unwavering. She was polite, specific about what she wanted, and she was dismissed repeatedly, based solely on her appearance. A withering look from Blake was barely concealed, but the damage was already done. The words, simple yet powerful, had broken through the carefully constructed facade of the dealership's supposed exclusivity. The onlookers, who had previously remained silent, now shifted uncomfortably, their earlier judgments suddenly feeling heavy and misplaced. The atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. The tables had begun to turn. Alexander turned his attention back to Richard Mason, his expression calm, but the quiet power in his presence was undeniable. You know, it's interesting, he said, his voice measured, deliberate. My wife not only found this dealership lacking in service, but she also runs the Collins Foundation for Children with Disabilities. It's been her life's work, long before I met her. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle upon them. The implications hung heavy in the air. The man before them, dressed simply, was not just a shopper seeking a luxury car. She was a woman who had dedicated her life to helping others, a woman who had quietly transformed the lives of thousands of vulnerable children. The sheer scale of her impact, the tens of millions raised for specialized medical equipment and educational programs, was a silent testament to her compassion and her worth. Alexander continued, his gaze unwavering, his words laced with a quiet pride. She chooses to dress simply because she believes in living modestly, despite our means. She finds that it keeps her connected to the families she helps. It's one of the countless reasons I love her. The words were simple, yet they carried an immense weight, revealing a depth of character and values that Blake and Mason had completely failed to recognize. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. Richard Mason's face had gone pale. The carefully constructed image of his dealership as a bastion of exclusivity was crumbling, replaced by a painful awareness of the hypocrisy at its core. The quiet power of truth and the quiet strength of Maggie had created the first cracks. The next steps would determine whether the entire system would shatter. Richard Mason, his face pale, stammered a response. Mr. Collins, I assure you, this does not reflect the values of our dealership. We pride ourselves on. Alexander interrupted, his voice calm but firm, a quiet strength underlying his words. Actions speak louder than mission statements, Mr. Mason. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. The silence in the showroom was absolute, broken only by the quiet hum of the air conditioning. Blake stood rigid, his carefully constructed professional persona shattered. Alexander continued, his gaze moving from Mason to Blake, then to the silent onlookers. Now, regarding the Azure, he said, his voice low but resonant, I'm not here to purchase just one vehicle. A glimmer of hope flickered in Blake's eyes, a desperate grasping for a chance at redemption. I was planning to purchase the Azure for my wife's sister, as she intended. But I was also considering a fleet replacement for our corporate vehicles, 7 in total, and my personal collection could use updating as well. Mason's eyes widened. A sale of that magnitude would easily surpass their quarterly targets. The potential for significant revenue was clearly apparent, and a glimmer of hope flickered in his gaze. Alexander paused, letting the silence build, the unspoken implication hanging heavy in the air. However, he continued, his voice dropping even lower, I find myself questioning whether this is the right establishment for such a significant investment. The silence stretched, taut, uncomfortable. Blake looked physically ill. The weight of his actions, the potential consequences, pressed down on him with the force of a physical blow. He'd misjudged Maggie, and now he was paying the price. Richard Mason, desperate to salvage the situation, spoke quickly. Mr. Collins, he began, his voice filled with genuine contrition, I cannot apologize enough for this unfortunate incident. I assure you, this is not how we conduct business. Please allow us to make this right. Alexander considered this for a moment, his expression thoughtful. Perhaps there is a way forward, he said finally, his voice still quiet, but now laced with a hint of measured consideration. But it would require more than just selling me cars. Anything, Richard assured him, his voice laced with a desperate eagerness to appease this powerful client. The Collins Foundation is hosting a benefit gala next month, Alexander announced, his gaze turning to Blake. We're raising funds for a new adaptive sports complex for children with physical disabilities. Blake, he said, addressing the mortified sales manager directly, I think your presence there would be educational. Blake swallowed hard, his usual confident demeanor completely gone. Sir, not as a guest? He stammered, a desperate question barely escaping his lips. Alexander smiled subtly. As a volunteer, he clarified, his voice gentle but firm. The foundation is always looking for people to help with setup, to assist the children, to see firsthand the work being done. The implication was clear. This wasn't just about selling cars anymore. This was about a profound lesson in empathy and humility. Alexander turned his gaze to Richard Mason, and the dealership might consider implementing a training program on unconscious bias. I know several excellent consultants. Richard nodded emphatically, the words absolutely and welcome escaping his lips before he could fully comprehend the full weight of the implications. The shift in power was palpable, unmistakable. The encounter had moved from a simple sales transaction to a profound moment of reckoning. The implications stretched far beyond the sale of a car, reaching into the heart of the dealership's values and culture. It was the beginning of a long road to genuine change, but the first step had been taken, and the ripple effects were already evident in the uneasy quiet that settled over the dealership. Alexander considered Richard Mason's desperate plea for reconciliation. The silence stretched thick with unspoken tension. Blake stood rigid, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The potential loss of a massive sale, a sale that could make or break their quarterly targets, was a stark reality hanging heavy in the air. Alexander turned his attention to Daniel, the young salesman who had spoken up, his quiet act of defiance a testament to his integrity. There was a quiet strength in the young man that had shone through the tense situation. It was a strength that deserved to be rewarded. I'm not here to punish, Alexander said, his voice low but firm, his words carrying a quiet power that resonated through the showroom. I'm here to educate. He paused, his gaze lingering on Blake, who visibly flinched under the weight of his unspoken words. It was a look that spoke of profound disappointment. Regarding the Azure, Alexander continued, his voice measured, my wife has excellent taste, doesn't she? He lightly ran a hand along the sleek lines of the car, a subtle gesture that acknowledged Maggie's initial desire and appreciation. The quiet strength of his actions was apparent. He was choosing to demonstrate his respect for his wife's desires and feelings. I will purchase the Azure for her sister, as she intended, and I'll let young Mr. Daniel handle the paperwork, Alexander stated, his gaze shifting to the surprised yet honored young salesman. Daniel's eyes widened, his expression reflecting a mixture of shock and gratitude. Mason, desperate to salvage something, attempted to interject about the potential for a larger sale, but Alexander cut him short with a quiet, decisive gesture. His silence spoke more powerfully than any words. The unspoken message hung heavy in the air. Alexander had chosen to buy only one car, deliberately forgoing the lucrative corporate fleet and personal collection sales. The potential for millions in revenue deliberately left on the table. It was a powerful demonstration of the value Alexander placed on integrity and justice. It was a strategic act, a quiet power play designed to deliver a more profound lesson than any simple reprimand. The dealership would lose a substantial amount of profit, but the costs of ignoring and silencing others far outweighed any monetary value. The silence stretched again, an unspoken acknowledgement of the magnitude of his decision and the impact it would have on the dealership. The sales potential was gone, but the opportunity for real change was at hand. A month later, the grand ballroom of the Boston Hotel pulsed with a vibrant energy. The Collins Foundation Benefit Gala was a celebration of possibility, a testament to Maggie's unwavering dedication. Children with various disabilities, their families, donors, medical professionals, and supporters mingled in a joyful atmosphere. It was a night dedicated to hope, resilience, and the quiet dignity of the human spirit. Near the entrance, Blake Thompson, dressed not in his usual tailored suit, but in the event staff uniform, directed guests with a quiet efficiency. The past month had been a period of profound transformation. His volunteer work at the foundation, initially undertaken as a penance, had become something far more significant. Witnessing the challenges these children faced daily and the extraordinary grace and resilience with which they met those challenges had profoundly altered his perspective. He'd watched children laugh, struggle, persevere. He'd seen the unwavering dedication of Maggie and her team, the quiet dignity of the families they supported. He had learned that true value lay not in designer labels or luxury cars, but in the quiet acts of kindness, in the unwavering commitment to improving the lives of others. The cost of his arrogance had been steep, but it was a cost worth paying if it led to change. Across the room, Maggie Collins, elegant in a simple blue dress, approached him. Her smile held no trace of malice, only quiet understanding. "How are you finding the experience, Blake?" she asked, her voice soft. Blake considered her question, running a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture he hadn't realized he was making. "Humbling," he finally replied, his voice barely a whisper, "and necessary." Maggie nodded gently, her gaze holding a warmth that felt both supportive and quietly knowing. "Thomas seems to have taken a liking to you," she observed, referring to a young boy in a wheelchair whom Blake had been assisting. "He's teaching me about adaptive basketball," Blake admitted, a faint smile touching his lips. "Apparently, I have terrible form." Maggie laughed, a genuine, heartfelt laugh that echoed the warmth of the evening. "He's an honest coach," she commented. Blake's expression grew serious. "Mrs. Collins," he began, his voice laced with a genuine sincerity that was far removed from his previous arrogance. "I know I've apologized formally, but I need to say it directly. I'm truly sorry for how I treated you." Maggie met his gaze, her own eyes holding no trace of lingering resentment. "There's no excuse," she agreed, her voice calm and compassionate. "But the question is, what have you learned?" Blake looked thoughtful, his expression reflective. "That worth isn't determined by appearance, position, or possessions," he replied, his voice carrying a newfound understanding. "And that everyone deserves respect until they prove otherwise, not the other way around." "Good lessons," Maggie acknowledged, a hint of amusement in her eyes. "Expensive ones too, I imagine." Blake nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. The cost of his arrogance had been substantial, not just financially, but more importantly, in terms of lost opportunity and the damage inflicted on his character. The path to redemption had begun, not through hollow apologies, but through genuine change and a willingness to learn from his mistakes. The quiet power of understanding had begun to transform him. The evening was far from over, but something precious and extraordinary had already been revealed. Later that evening, as the gala wound down, Maggie and Alexander found themselves near Blake. He was no longer the impeccably dressed sales manager. He wore the simple uniform of a volunteer, his demeanor markedly different. The arrogance had been replaced by a quiet humility, a stark contrast to the man Maggie had encountered a month prior. He was assisting a young boy in a wheelchair, his movements gentle, his interactions patient and kind. It was a subtle shift, but profoundly telling. Maggie, elegant in a simple blue dress, approached him. Her expression held none of the resentment he might have expected. It was a look of quiet observation. "How are you finding the experience, Blake?" she asked, her voice soft. Blake considered her question, his gaze falling to the boy in the wheelchair before meeting hers again. "Humbling," he finally answered, the word hanging in the air, heavy with meaning. "And necessary," he added, a quiet strength underlying his admission. Maggie nodded, a subtle understanding in her eyes. "Thomas seems to have taken a liking to you," she observed, referring to the boy. Blake smiled faintly. "He's teaching me about adaptive basketball," he confessed. "Apparently, I have terrible form." Maggie chuckled, a warm, genuine sound. "He's an honest coach," she commented, her eyes twinkling. Blake's expression grew serious, a quiet weight settling upon his features. "Mrs. Collins," he began, his voice sincere, devoid of the previous condescension. "I know I've apologized formally, but I need to say it directly. I'm truly sorry for how I treated you. There's no excuse." Maggie listened quietly, patiently, her gaze steady. The apology wasn't hollow. It carried the weight of genuine regret, of a profound shift in perspective. She saw it in his eyes, in the way he now interacted with the children, in the quiet humility that replaced his former arrogance. "You're right, there isn't," she agreed, her tone gentle, devoid of any lingering bitterness. "But the question is, what have you learned?" Blake looked thoughtful, a quiet contemplation settling upon his features. "That worth isn't determined by appearance, position, or possessions," he said, his voice low, his words carrying the weight of newfound understanding, "and that everyone deserves respect until they prove otherwise, not the other way around." The unspoken words hung between them, an acknowledgement of the profound lesson learned, the painful cost of prejudice, and the possibility of genuine change. The simple conversation held a profound weight. It wasn't just an apology, but a testament to the transformative power of empathy, humility, and a willingness to confront one's own biases. The encounter wasn't about the past, but about the path to a better future. The quiet power of this simple yet profound change was undeniable. Later, as the gala's energy began to quiet, Alexander found himself speaking with Blake again. The initial tension had dissipated, replaced by a quiet respect. Blake, no longer the arrogant sales manager, was now a thoughtful participant in the evening. He seemed to genuinely connect with the children and families, his movements now filled with a kindness Maggie hadn't seen before. Alexander studied him for a moment. "You've been working with Mr. Mason on revamping the dealership's customer approach, I hear," Alexander said, his voice calm. Blake nodded. "Yes, sir. No more qualifying by appearance," he stated, a hint of pride, almost a relief in his voice. "It's been a humbling experience." He paused, looking directly at Alexander. The weight of his words was apparent. The quiet power of understanding and empathy was evident. Alexander smiled subtly. "I'm glad to hear it," he replied, his tone conveying genuine approval. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared recognition of the profound transformation that had occurred, a transformation that had gone far beyond an apology. A beat of silence hung between them. Alexander's gaze turned, thoughtful, towards the ballroom, observing the energy that Maggie had been instrumental in creating. He then turned his gaze back towards Blake. "Which reminds me," he continued, his voice measured, "about that corporate fleet I mentioned. We're still in the market. Perhaps you could handle that transaction?" Blake's expression registered shock, a flicker of disbelief, before settling into genuine gratitude. The implication hung heavy in the air. Alexander was offering Blake not just a business opportunity, but a chance at redemption, a chance to prove he had genuinely learned from his mistakes. He saw that his opportunity wasn't simply about the monetary value of a contract. It was a chance to demonstrate his commitment to lasting change and empathy. "I would be honored, Mr. Collins," Blake replied, his voice filled with a sincerity that was both heartfelt and deeply moving. "Truly honored." The offer wasn't just a business deal. It was a bridge, a pathway to a future where appearances held less weight than character, and where judgments based on superficial observations no longer dictated opportunities. The future remained uncertain, but Blake had a chance at redemption, and he intended to make the most of it. The silent strength of Alexander's actions spoke volumes. A chance at redemption, but one that would require genuine change. Later that evening, as the gala's energy began to fade, Blake found himself watching Maggie and Alexander from across the room. They weren't flaunting their wealth or influence. They were genuinely connecting with each child and family, their interactions filled with warmth and genuine care. The quiet strength of their presence was deeply moving. He watched Maggie interacting with a young boy in a wheelchair, her kindness and empathy striking a chord within him. It struck Blake anew how simple Maggie's clothing was, yet her lack of pretension only seemed to amplify her inherent grace and dignity. A month ago, he would have dismissed her based solely on her appearance. Now, he understood that true value ran far deeper than designer labels, luxury cars, or executive titles. He'd learned a painful but essential lesson. a lesson that echoed with the quiet dignity of the children and families he was witnessing. As Blake helped Thomas, the boy he'd been assisting, back into his wheelchair, the boy grinned up at him. "You know what, Mr. Blake?" he said, his voice filled with childlike sincerity. "You're pretty cool for a grown-up." Blake smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes, a smile that held a depth of meaning he hadn't known a month before. "Coming from you, Thomas," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "That's the highest compliment I've received in a very long time." And he meant it. He watched Maggie and Alexander mingle with the other families, their warmth and commitment undeniable. He reflected on how completely his perception had been transformed. He thought about how he might have treated anyone like Maggie, like anyone at all, based on their appearance and outward presentations. He was struck again by the unfairness of this and the realization that his actions had a ripple effect. He thought about Daniel, the young salesman who had spoken up, whose courage and empathy had inspired him. The quiet power of one courageous action had changed his life. He considered all of this, his own misjudgments, the consequences of his actions, and the profound transformation that had occurred. He understood that we all make judgments based on appearances, but as Blake Thompson had discovered, looking beyond the surface can reveal extraordinary people and life-changing opportunities. The true measure of wealth, he realized, had nothing to do with a bank account. It was about how you treated others, especially when you believed no one important was watching. The evening ended not with a conclusion, but with a beginning, the slow and profound transformation of a man learning to judge less and to see more. It was a lesson he would carry forward, a lesson that might inspire others to do the same. If you felt judged by your appearance, dismissed for your background, or silenced by a dismissive tone, then perhaps you can relate. This story is for those who have felt overlooked, forgotten, or misunderstood. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We're all in this together. Let's find connection and understanding. We'll be back with more stories soon.